Dan Look. Dan is a math professor at St. Lawrence University. And in fact, you're the department chair now, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
It's amazing, but see, you start working on Howard like this, all of a sudden they start giving you promotions.
Yes.
Keep this in mind. This is good stuff. Dan uses math to find out really interesting things about these stories. Mark likes to call it foul sorcery, but it's amazing the things that Dan can do using software, looking at different changes in the way different writers use words and use language and use grammar. This is a discipline that's called Stylometrics. And so Dan's been using this to do things like prove with math that DeCamp does not write Conan as well as Robert E. Howard. Yes, I know, we all know this, but he's got the math to prove it now. This is great. All right, not quite. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Dan Look.
Excellent. I'm going to try to. Yeah, I'm going to try to do without the microphone because I do this a lot and I know that it'll come in and out and in and out and that would be distracting. So, can everybody hear me? All right. Knock it up just a notch, something like this? Yeah. Excellent. All right. So, as Jeff mentioned, what I do is stylometry. And this is the statistical analysis of writing styles. I think I've got a little blurb here. Well, actually, okay. You know what? Oh, am I having technical difficulties already? There we go. Before I get into what stylometry is, let me introduce the problem. For those of you who aren't aware, I'm assuming most people here, how many know about Almuric? Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. And I could probably ask how many know more about Almuric than I, and the same hands would most likely go up. So I'm not an expert in Almuric. You know, I've read it, I know Almuric, but I'm looking at it from the mathematical angle. And so, just for those of you who may not be aware, or as a refresher, in 1939, there was a blurb in Weird Tales, I believe it's April, but I'm not positive about that talks about this upcoming story by Robert E. Howard. Here's the blurb. The important part here is basically that he's saying that Howard was working on a story. He had a first draft and part of a second draft, nearly completed a revision, which was to be his final. A lot of that is up for speculation. You know, the fact that he was writing it for Weird Tales is most likely not true. The fact that his second version was probably going to be his final, again, that's most likely, I would imagine, not true, given how Howard normally went through with his revisions. But again, this is Farnsworth writing for his audience. And what he says is, therefore, you know, this is so great, you need to read it. Therefore, we've taken his first draft and we've taken his second draft. The second draft ends somewhere, and we have pieced together the nearly completed final draft that Howard wrote with the final pages of Howard's rough draft, which contains a smashing denouement, or however that's pronounced. Denouement. There we go. And so the question arose, who is the we here, and what does it mean by finishing this? And so it's been pegged as, I think, February 1934. Is that right, Patrice? Yeah, getting the thumbs up. February 1934, when he was working on this, most likely not for Weird Tales. It's for actually an English publisher working on one of his first full-length novels. And for some reason, not quite clear, he stopped working on this. And when you read the novel as it's presented now, there are some issues with the ending that Howard fans bring up a lot as this just doesn't sound like Howard. There are some stylistic writing issues people bring up, but then there's things like use of particular words that Howard wouldn't have used, and one of the biggest ones is the very ending itself. The last couple of paragraphs talks about kind of almost bringing civilization to this planet of Almuric, which is not something that Howard would normally be writing about. And so there's speculation on who finished this. And for a while, the front runner was Klein. And that's because Klein was his literary agent, had access to the papers, and maybe, you know, was also a writer himself and possibly had done this. Right? And so, again, the question, who finished this? So there were some potential authors, right? I just mentioned Otis Klein, and really, Morgan Holmes addresses this, and others have addressed it as well. Morgan's in the first posthumous collaboration has pictures of the actual receipts, showed that Klein only took 10% as agent and commission. He would have gotten probably 50% had he finished it, and so most likely Klein is not the person who finished it. In this same essay, Holmes puts forth some other potential authors, and other people have put forth authors. And so what I did was essentially grabbed all of those authors and decided to take a look at them. And the particular authors are Farnsworth Wright. He's one I'll mention in a bit as a little bit tricky for a couple of reasons. Edmund Hamilton, Henry Kuttner, E. Hoffman Price, and Otto Bender, who would have been writing under the name Eondo Bender at that time because he wasn't still writing with his brother, but Earl and Otto is Eondo, and that's Eondo Bender. But at this time, it was just Otto on his own. Right? Now, a new letter surfaced a few months ago that is pretty compelling, actually. This is a letter from Farnsworth Wright, and there's this one change here, really. The novel's so striking, I thought it would be unfair if we didn't give a chance to read this to the writers, so I pieced together an ending from the first draft and used it to complete the second draft to make the story. And so that really, you know, to a lot of people, that's the end. You know, Wright finished it, therefore, end of the discussion. But there are still people who aren't convinced that Wright finished it. Maybe the I was speaking a little bit, you know, exaggeratedly. And also, what does it mean to be finished, right? When you read this, I pieced together an ending from the first draft. So it could also be that Wright wrote a bit of this. Now that was addressed by Holmes as well. Wright had some medical issues at the time. He wasn't really writing much, and so possibly, you know, he can be discounted for that. But I'm still considering him. Right. So here's where my stuff comes in. So I do stylometry, and this is the statistical study of the written word. And so I'll show you an example of actually how to think of this. So I concentrate on the words that you use a lot, the, of, and, things like that. So not on rare words, which is what you might think you'd concentrate on, but really common words. And the reason for this is those are the words that, one, we don't think about that much when we write. And so it would be very easy for me to write, unlike myself, if I know what words you're looking for, you know? Well, I never talk about sea battles, so I'll write a book about sea battles, then you won't think it's me. You know, it's very easy to fool those kinds of tests. It's also very easy for somebody to go in and do some editing and make a story sound completely unlike one written by the person who actually wrote the majority of it. So there are particular words mentioned a lot that Howard would never use, but it would be really easy to go in there and add those words, and then have you really rewritten the story or just changed some words. So I'm looking at these types of words, often called function words. They don't carry much meaning on their own, but they're how you glue your sentences together. And so it really shows how you write. And so I may say the fork is to the left of the plate, and you may say it's on the left of the plate. Both of those are giving the same meaning, but if I always say to the left and you always say on the left, and we get a piece that is by one of us, and it says on the left, you know who it's probably by. Gather up 50, 75, 100 of those, and you've got a pretty solid case for who may have written it that is also subconscious, which is, to me, very important, not something that can be easily replicated or fooled. So in this particular example, the words to and you are words that I would hone in on. One of them being used, you know, around twice as often, and the other one almost 3 times as often. And so you collect a bunch of words like that and look for those in the text by the person that you don't know who you know, the text that has the unknown authorship. Right. Okay, so just to demonstrate how this one method that I'm using today works, I'm going to show you Howard versus DeCamp. Okay, so there are 2 types of graphs I'm going to show you, both of them essentially showing the same thing. What I'm doing is telling the computer, here are the texts, look for the 100 most common words used among all the writers, make sure those words are used by everybody, so everybody has to use them, and then look at the unknown piece and compare just Howard's use of those words and just DeCamp's use of those words, and see if you can split them up. All right? This is all done by the computer, okay? These graphics are not made by me. It's just the computer looking at these words, to, of, and saying, okay, here's how they line up. And it turns out to work amazingly well, okay? This is Robert E. Howard versus some DeCamp stories. Conan of the Isles, City of Skulls, Castle of Terror, Black Tears, Curse of the Monolith, and The Thing in the Crypt. Obviously not just DeCamp and Carter as well. And you see, it's almost intuitive how the graph works, right? The closer they are in writing style, the closer they'll be clumped together. So we see a large clump of green up here, with one red in there, which I'll mention in a second, and then a large clump of red down here. The split happens kind of way back here at the very beginning. And then there's a split here, which I don't really know what the reason is for that. But some of these Howard stories read differently than some of these other Howard stories in terms of those words. The important thing, though, is the split of DeCamp and Howard. Without me telling the computer anything about who was who, it did pretty darn well in separating these two authors, just based on words like the and of and. It dropped the ball on the Thing in the Crypt, right? The Thing in the Crypt has a couple specialties, though, right? The Thing in the Crypt, I believe, was Lynn Carter rewritten into this story, and so it has a different history. There's other reasons it may be in there, but even if Thing in the Crypt was written by the exact same author who wrote these, I would still say it's not 100%, but it's pretty compelling that the computer does a pretty good job of telling these two authors apart. This is a similar diagram. So the last one used 100 words. But you might ask, what if you used 90? What if you asked 110? Does that make a difference? This one looks at 50 words, makes a graph, 60 makes a graph, all the way up to 150, and then kind of takes an average and shoves it together. Again, it's kind of intuitive, right? The branches are how related they are. Once again, we see pretty much identical results. We have DeCamp and Carter clustering here, a pretty wide spread, and then you have most of the, you have the Howard stuff, and then, of course, Thing in the Crypt is shoved in the middle. So what I'm going to do is take each of these authors, first verify that this works, that we can actually tell them apart, and then toss Almuric in and see where it lands. So for Howard, it's kind of important to stick as closely as possible to the genre and time of the writing. I've shown that Isaac Asimov's 1940s writings and his 1980s writings, this will separate them. It can tell that he wrote them at different times. And it can tell his Foundation series apart from his Robot Mystery series. So you've got to be pretty good with the text that you're choosing. So for Conan stories, I used all of them between 33 and 35, which is pretty much all of them. I think the only one left off is Phoenix on the Sword. For non-Howard stories, due to when Almuric appeared, right, 1939 or so, I used stories between 33 and 42, trying to stay as close to that time as possible, but I have a limitation because I need to have these texts digital and reliable. And so finding digital copies of all these authors wasn't easy. And then scrubbing them to make sure that they were accurate wasn't easy either. And for certain authors, I then also check specific stories. So I do them by date and by story. So as an example, well, you'll see the examples when we see them. So I figured I'd start with Oak, with Klein, right? The one that pretty much nobody believes did it anymore anyway, due to Holmes's argument with the receipt, which is pretty compelling. So here are the texts that I use, 33 to 39. Some of them probably not great for comparing to Almuric, right? Revenge of the Robot, it's probably going to be a different genre, right? But I'm sticking time-wise with this. Even using time, right? Look at this is just Howard versus Oak versus Klein. Perfect separation in this case. And then again with the cluster, perfect separation. Right? So throw in Almuric, right? Here's the drum roll that probably wouldn't happen because everybody knows the answer. Bam. We have Klein down here, Howard up here. Here's what I do with Almuric. As far as people trying to peg down where the split happens, which is a separate question that I'm really interested in, the most common stated split is right when he says by fax jawbone. So I basically split Almuric into two pieces. Almuric underline 1 is all the stuff before that. Underline 2 is all the stuff after that. To see, do they clump differently, right? Here they both clump together. And what you're going to see is Howard's best Conan story, Veil of the Lost Women. Not his best story. That story and Almuric really get along. Those stories are almost always linked together. And there could be reasons for that people who know more about this than I do know, right? Almuric wasn't a finished story. So it reads a little choppy, right? Veil of the Lost Women isn't a great story either. So I don't know. There may be some link there, but anyway. Same thing when we get the bootstrap consensus tree, which is where they're kind of trying to make the consensus between all these different word counts. Okay. All right. Now, I also took Almuric and said, well, let's break it into a bunch of samples. Maybe by fax jawbone is not where the split happens. Maybe it happens 1,000 words after that, and my test is all invalid. So one weakness of my method is I need at least 1,500 consecutive words, primarily by whichever author would have written it, okay? So I broke the Almuric into pieces that were as small as they could be to be reasonably reliable, and just threw them all in and said, where do you lie? And what we get here again is Klein still clumped, Howard, Howard. One Klein is getting close, Vision of Venus. And then we've got in red are all the samples for the stuff that kind of people agreed was Howard. And in green is the stuff that people thought, you know, that's the Bithax jawbone stuff. And we see that the green stuff is a little separated off, but nothing that would ring any bells as far as I'm concerned. They clump together, sure, but this really looks to me like, at least when you're comparing it with Klein and Howard, these ones were written more similar to each other than the other ones were to them. Now, I grabbed that by date. I was told Buccaneers of Venus might be a better comparison, right, just in terms of genre. And so I would like to use those stories. So I grabbed the Buccaneers of Venus collection, Planet of Peril, Prince of Peril, Port of Peril, and I broke it into 15 samples of roughly 10,000 words each. And that's a very heavy sample, so it should be fairly reliable because you only need around, again, 1,500 or so words. When I did that, am I going the right way? There we go. When I did that and threw in Almuric again, Oak's down here with all of his Buccaneers hanging out, Howard's up here hanging out, and Almuric is in Veil of the Lost Women. For those who may have noticed, this line moved up a little bit. That's just indicating a further strength of the test. But again, Almuric 1 and 2 still with Veil of the Lost Women, and they're still right together, which to me is partially indicating that there's a chance that that was by the exact same person, both pieces. Cluster, same thing. In fact, this is extremely, now that we've got a really nice Buccaneer of Venus sample, the computer has an easier job because it's not dealing with genre differences as well as author differences, but primarily authorial differences. Okay, Edmund Hamilton. I used these texts 36 to 42. And again, the computer has no problem telling Hamilton from Howard in either of the tests. Throw in Almuric, and now we do get a separation of Almuric Part 1 and Part 2, but it's still all stuck within the Howard camp, right? None of it's leaked over to Hamilton. Now you may ask, why aren't those two together anymore? They were in the last one. Well, that's because the pool of words that we're using for comparison is chosen by all of the authors being used. Okay, so all of the Klein words are gone now and they're replaced by Hamilton. That's going to shift the location of some of these stories. The important thing, still in the Howard region. Same thing with the consensus tree, which is to me the stronger of the two because it uses 50 to 150. When you break it into samples, again, you get kind of some samples scattering a little bit, but they're scattering throughout Howard. They're not scattering into Hamilton at all. And nobody's scattling, whatever that is. Right? There we go, scattling. We'll stylometrically test that. Kuttner, okay? Now, you may know Kuttner wrote a lot with, you know, Kuttner and Moore, right? Kuttner very prolific. I chose stories just written by Kuttner. There is one that I accidentally let slip into the graph. We Kill People, I think is what it's called, which was by Lewis Paget was the authorial name for that, and I think that's Kuttner and Moore. Yeah, but I what's that? 46, Kuttner and Moore? I'll trust you. And, okay, yes. Oh, so you'll notice that is in there. If you want to copy the story, I have it. But that is in there. And these are the ones I use for Kuttner because I found a lot in the good dates. But again, you know, Dr. Cyclops may not be the best comparison with Almuric, right? When you do this test, you have some problems, right? Some of the Kuttner is slipping in with some of the Howard. Right? I'm not going to test Almuric with this. It's already, to me, it's still doing a reasonable job, but it's already kind of failed. And again, I think that's because Kuttner's stories are so widely spread from the samples I chose. So, rather than consensus tree, the same thing. So rather than doing that, let's go to ELAC, right? The ELAC of Atlantis series. That's closer in style to what we're getting with Almuric. So I used the ELAC of Atlantis collection, which has Spawn of Dagon, Thunder in the Dawn, Beyond the Phoenix, right? And a couple of his Prince Rainier stories as well. And I did the same thing I did earlier where I broke it up, this time 10,000 word pieces, 6 of them. And now we get a really nice separation because it's not dealing with the genre difference as well as the authorial difference. ELAC's downstairs, Howard's upstairs. Same thing over here, except now not up and down. Throw in Almuric, and again, Veil of the Lost Women, right? There's Veil of the Lost Women, but Almuric is still solidly in the Howard campaign, right? In the Howard camp. Same thing with the consensus tree. To me, what this is saying is that these people aren't the people who finished Almuric. Or, I should be careful, if they did have a hand in finishing it, it was a paragraph here, paragraph there, a few sentences here, word changes, word rearrangements, but it wasn't sitting down and writing 3 consecutive pages. Right? Throw in the samples, and we end up getting a similar thing. Now, this one's interesting for another reason. The Almurics all cluster together with their best friend, Veil of the Lost Women, downstairs. This is because now we've got enough samples that it's starting to pick up, oh, these Almuric ones are more like each other than the other ones are different from each other, so we'll clump them. Right. But notice, Almuric sample 1 and 2 are both in there. So if that second sample was written by somebody else, they're doing a really, really, really good job of imitating the writing style of whoever wrote the first part. Right? They're still clumped right in. There is a little bit of a separation. And for my work on editing, this is the kind of thing you see when you look at drafts, is that they'll clump together, but there'll be a little bit of distance if somebody was working on a first draft versus a later draft. And then, again, here's the consensus tree, same thing we saw last time. Well, except now you notice that with a consensus tree, it does nestle them inside the Howard camp. E. Hoffman Price. I had an awfully hard time tracking down E. Hoffman Price ones. This is a pretty terrible comparison because I could only find these stories, and most of these are Spices, which are not good comparisons for Almuric. But you'll see again, they separate, and Almuric is still in Howard. But this, if it happened to be E. Hoffman Price, I would need better samples of writing more similar to the writing. If any of you have those digital or not, I'll type them up if I have to, right? But let me know. Okay. Otto Bender. All right, this to me is the big one, because this is where Holmes comes down as the author. And he mentioned some cogent stylistic points about why he would be the author and some comparisons with other stories. And so I decided to give this a test. Right. Here are the stories I used when just looking at date. And again, those of you really familiar with Bender are probably looking at this and saying, Teacher from Mars is not a good comparison to Almuric. I'll address that in a second. Still get a great separation. I go back to the name Eondo Bender here, even though it's really just Otto Bender. Eondo Bender and Howard are completely separate. When I throw in separate with the consensus as well, and a really nice separation too. And then when I throw in Almuric, again, Almuric's hanging out with Howard. And again, 1 and 2 are both side by side and next to Veil of the Lost Women, and quite a distance, quite separated from the Bender stuff. But this is the wrong Bender stuff. Well, here's the consensus tree picture as well. But this is the wrong Bender stuff. Maybe, I'll say that sentence one more time in a second. I also did it by sample. And again, you'll notice, same thing we've seen before. Still, all of the Almurics, they're a little separated among the Howards, but they're all still solidly within the Howard clusters. So Anton York is where I turned. The only reason I grabbed Anton York is that a couple of the people who have written on this mention Anton York in this series specifically when talking about stylistic similarities between the ending of Almuric and Bender's work. Anton York comes up a lot, and in particular, The Secret of Anton York is mentioned. So I use that as a test, because I'm like, this is what the people who think it's Bender think it's most like, and so that would be a good one to test. So I broke it into 4 pieces, 5,000 words each. Again, that's over twice as long as they need to be, and does a great job of separating them. The reason I have messy written after the Bender ones is that I got these a little bit later than the others, and I didn't get a chance to read through them like in their entirety to make sure the words were all properly matched up. Sometimes when you get e-texts, you probably know this, words will be pushed together or something like that. So what I did was I used a different type of test where it doesn't look at words, but it looks at 4-letter combinations, and that tends to take care of it. That's already boring enough. I won't say anything more about it. But there is a method there, and I can explain it to anybody who cares, but that's why I tagged this with messy. Still separates it with the consensus, and then here will be the only drum roll probably applicable. When I throw in Almuric, bam, again, it's Howard, right? It's not even close to coming up as Bender in this particular case. Same with the consensus tree. And when I throw Almuric broken into samples, we get, it looks almost just like the graphs that we've seen before. All right? So we have to be careful with the conclusions for this. Okay? What this means is that using the samples I used, so if anybody is looking at this and saying, oh no, for Edmund Hamilton, you should have used this, let me know. I'll throw it in. It takes 5 seconds once I've got it properly processed to do. What this means is based on the stories I used, Almuric reads, in terms of the function words, more like Howard every single time than it does like any other of the authors that I just looked at. So if they had a hand in it, it was probably what I would call a small hand. So that ending that everybody, I don't know if everybody hates it, but that ending that a lot of people hate where let's all be friends and live on Almuric, that easily could have been written by anybody. That would not be picked up here. It's what, 400, 300 words? That's not going to come up. And so this won't work for that, okay? Same with occurrences of odd words throughout that second half, which I know some people concentrate on. He wouldn't have used this word, he wouldn't have used this word. That wouldn't be picked up by this either. What this says to me is that most likely what Farnsworth Wright said in that last piece is probably pretty much exactly what happened. Had the two pieces, took the second piece, maybe went through and did some cleaning, maybe even did a little bit of writing. I mean, he's still writing letters. He can dictate. I mean, writing a couple of paragraphs, I don't know if that's outside of Farnsworth Wright's ability at this time, but that's all he would need to do some of these changes to make it read the way that we see now. I have not been able to test any of Farnsworth Wright's writing against Almuric. And the reason that Farnsworth Wright letter didn't come out that long ago, the new letter that says I pieced it together, Wright also, the only stuff he wrote's like 15 years earlier than Almuric, and I've had a really hard time finding any of those samples. So as soon as I get them, I'll run those tests. But I'll tell you what I think is going to happen, and it's going to be pretty much the same thing we saw. Even if he heavily edited, I think it's going to come up Howard unless he actually just sat down and wrote multiple pages upon themselves. My next test is going to be trying to figure out where the first draft ended and the second draft began. That's really hard, but I'm working on a method that's going to kind of drag through and see if it can figure out where that switch happened. There's already one that exists, but it doesn't work well with these samples. But everything I've done so far on my own is coming up Howard. Now, Frank Kaufman does some stuff where he's doing a combination of looking at rare words and sentence structure, comparing the two. That method has a chance of picking up things like Farnsworth Wright doing heavy editing and things like that. And so that's something I'm anxious to hear about and work more with Frank on. But with these things, it seems like the majority of it was written by Howard. And I'll end there.